Thank you, Mark. So does this microphone sound really loud? Is it? No? Okay. It does to me, and I feel like I'm having to kind of lower my voice, and if I get excited, that's not going to happen. I don't want to blow anybody's ears out. I think they had just adjusted it. Thank you, sir. So we're in 1 Peter chapter 3 this morning, and I was looking over my notes. Thing is, there's a couple of different ways that I can go with this. We've been talking a lot about submission. Peter begins in chapter 2, verse 13, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men. And we spent quite a bit of time discussing what it looks like for Christians to be submissive to their government, even if they don't agree with their government. We spent actually 2 weeks on that. Then you get down into verse 18, and it says, slaves, submit to your masters with all respect. And we talked about that last week. In chapter 3, verse 1, wives, in the same way, be submissive to your husbands. And there's a couple of different ways that I can approach this. One of the things that I've done in the past is talked about the big egalitarian movement that's gone through our world, and not just our world, but also in churches today, where we've kind of we look at that and we say for women to submit to men is a wrong thing. We don't like that. We don't like the language. We don't want anything to do with that. Everybody's equal. And we can talk about that this morning because I've got some things to say about that. Another thing that came up last Sunday, Jerry Schutz kind of brought something up, and I thought if he was here this morning, we'd approach it from that respect, and that is dealing with how can a woman submit to a husband when she's in a bad relationship. And so there's a lot of things we can talk about that. So just kind of a poll survey here this morning. What do you guys want to hear? You want to hear more about how women in a marriage that's not good should submit to their husbands, or do we want to kind of talk about women and men's roles? All in favor of women in a bad situation, in a bad marriage, raise your hand. All of you want to talk a little more about the egalitarian stuff? Okay, then that's the direction we're going to go. So those of you that raised your hand for the women in a bad marriage, come see me afterwards, and I'll straighten you out, okay? Yeah, no, won't happen. That one gets a lot more complicated. So I'm kind of glad you chose what you did. So a few years ago, it's been many years ago now. I'm getting a little older. I got a call from my cousin down in Texas. I was in preaching school, and she calls me up on the phone. Her name's Michelle. She said, hey, Lance, I was wondering if you could marry me. And I said, well, I can't, Michelle. I said, number one, I'm already married. Number two, you're my cousin. That's weird. I know our roots are from Arkansas, but that's not right. And it threw her for a minute. She didn't realize I was joking, because evidently preachers aren't supposed to joke. So since I was in school to be a preacher, she thought I'd lost all sense of humor. But so anyway, we started talking about it. And one of the things that she was very adamant about was that in my lesson to her that I was not to use the word submit. That she was offended by that. She did not want me to use that kind of language. And she was only half joking. And so I knew where she was coming from, because those lines don't really fit in our world today. And we have to be honest. Women have been mistreated in our world. Would you guys agree with that? Women have been looked down upon. They've been treated very poorly by men. And so a lot of this movement is a reaction against that. I remember reading something that was written by a priest many, many years ago that said something about if your wife doesn't do what you tell her to, then you should take her out and beat her about the head and the neck until she does. And that was the teaching from the church, or that church anyway. And so we have to admit right up front that there has been a lot of abuse, and there have been a lot of things that people have done to put women down and treat women poorly. And so I think it's very important for us to go back and understand things from God's perspective. So, our societies become very egalitarian, and that means that women and men are completely equal in everything. There's no difference, there's no distinction between them as far as their roles. The attitude is there are no roles that a man has that a female is not also entitled to. The idea of a husband having any kind of headship or authority is a no-no. And so when we get to 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, we run into a problem. Because Peter indicates that there is some role of headship or authority that men have in a marital relationship. And so, this isn't just a problem in society, it's also become a problem in churches, because there are a lot of churches and church leaders who have taken this egalitarian view as well. And so when they get to this section of 1 Peter and some of the things that Paul says, they're left trying to justify how we can make everybody equal, when Peter and Paul both seem to indicate there are differences. There are different roles for each one. And so usually they deal with this in one of two different ways, or a couple of different ways. Some will just say, well, we just don't agree with Peter. And they're fine with that. I have a problem with that. I see Peter as an inspired author writing God's word to the churches today. Some people will say that the Apostle Peter wasn't really the author anyway, and that then they don't have to mess with it. But then it's like, well, then why do we even have it in the book if Peter didn't write it? And then the other option, their way they look at it, is they say, well, he was only speaking to his culture. And since we live in a very different culture these days, and we've been woke or enlightened, then what he says back then doesn't really apply to us today. But if we believe that the inspired apostle Peter did write the epistle, and we believe that his teaching is eternal, then we can't just reject it, ignore it, or disagree with it. And we have to understand it, and we have to put it into practice. And so, before we get into what Peter says in chapter 3 this morning, I'd like for us to lay a little background. Would somebody turn to Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, and read that out loud for us?
Then the Lord God said, "It is not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him."
Thank you, Ray. So God did not create an equal the way people in our society tell us today. He created a helper. Now, that doesn't mean he created a subordinate type of human being, but he created woman for a different role than what he'd created man. And we see an indication of that when we get down into Genesis chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, which is after the serpent had deceived Eve, and she ate from the forbidden fruit, and then she gave some to her husband. And if I could get someone to read Genesis chapter 3, verse 16 for me.
To the woman he said, "I will greatly increase your pain in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you."
Okay. Your desire will be for your husband. Does anybody's translation have anything different than that? Your desire will be contrary to your husband. Well, thank you, Christina. You said what I think it means, but you also ruined my joke. So, because I thought your desire will be for your husband. That sounds pretty good to me, right? Dory, because of the curse, she just desires me. Yeah. No. I think what this is implying here, and I've read a lot about this, I think what he's really saying is your desire is going to be to rule over your husband. Your desire is going to be for you to make all of the decisions. And I think we get to that just a little bit, because what he says is your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Now that seems to be a difference in roles there between the husband and the wife, doesn't it? Okay, you got one shaking their head. Mark.
I think, if you looked at different translations and so forth, you get the idea. I think what's being said there is that there's going to be conflict.
Right.
Over who's in charge, who gets to control. I think that's the meaning of it.
Right. There's going to be conflict over headship.
Yes.
Who's the head here? And so to rule over implies authority or headship. But I want us to keep in mind this is not necessarily a negative or abusive thing. Because that's immediately where our minds go today when we say, well, the husband is the head of the wife, and people automatically think, well, that's abusive language. I don't want my husband to be the head of me. He's not. But yet, isn't God our head? Yeah. Does that mean he's abusive? Isn't Christ the head of the church? Does that mean he's abusive and domineering and all that stuff? No, it doesn't. And so we have to understand authority with the language and the understanding that we're given in Scripture. And that's why I kind of want to go back and look at some of this. In Genesis chapter 3, when we get to verse 17, this is the curse he gives to Adam, or the punishment. To Adam, he said, because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat of it. And then he gives him his punishment. He's punished because he listened to his wife. Now, I'm not trying to make fun of. Don't laugh, Jerry. That's not the point here. The point is, who had God given the instructions to? You shall not eat from that tree. Who was God speaking to when he said that? He was speaking to Adam. He had given Adam the responsibility of protecting his family. Eve took matters into her own hand, made a decision, and Adam, by just letting her make that decision and go along with whatever his wife said, got both of them in trouble, right? Because God had given him a role, and he had given her a role, and they overstepped and understepped their boundaries. Does that make sense? Okay, if you don't agree with me, that's okay, because this is what in my study, this is where I've come to. So, and I know not everybody agrees with it. So if you don't agree, raise your hand and say but, and that's okay. We're all right with that. Of course, I can't hear you, so that might help too. So Genesis seems to support this view that God established an order with the husbands as the head. And the Apostle Paul seems to support this if you turn over into 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And I want us to turn over there. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I'm sorry, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3. It's bad when your sinuses are so bad you can't even see straight. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3, Paul says, now I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. God has established a certain order in things. The head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Not only does Paul say that the husband is the head of the wife, but he also tells us that headship is not an evil thing. Again, because Christ is the head of us. That's not an evil thing. And God is the head of Christ. That is not an evil thing. So headship is not an evil thing except for the fact that through history it's been made an evil thing. Does that make sense? So again, I want us to go back to kind of what the Scripture says about some of these things. In verse 8 and 9 of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, we read, For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. So again, God has established an order. He's established He created us an order when He created mankind. And so I want us to just understand that God Himself created different roles for husband and wife. And it's good, no matter what our society tells us. And just like my cousin and so many other young women whose weddings I've done, when they read what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3, they immediately go on edge. Wives, in the same way, be submissive to your husband. So one thing that I find interesting, as I've taught this before in different places and different settings, is when we talk about, Christians are supposed to submit to our governing authorities because they were instituted by God. Most Christians can kind of wrestle through that and say, yeah, I get that. I struggle with it sometimes, but I get that. When we talk about slaves submitting to your masters, they talk about, well, we don't have slavery today, but in some ways I can bring this into my workplace, and maybe I don't always like it that I have to endure being treated poorly for standing up for God, but I kind of get that, and I can make that work, because that way I have an influence on people around me. When they see my behavior, and I'm living such a good life among the pagans, that though they accuse me of doing wrong, they will glorify God on the day that He returns, because they see my good works. Then we get to wives, submit to your husbands, and people go, nope, not even going there. Don't even want to hear it. But we need to, because the same God that told us those other things says this. And so we need to kind of look at that. And a lot of times we'll try to reason our way out of it, even though Paul says the same things in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. And so we've got two passages of Scripture by two different inspired authors that tell us that wives are to submit to their husband. And so we need to keep in mind that it's the calling of all Christians to live a life of submission. There's nothing sexist in Peter calling wives to be submissive to their husbands. And so I hope I've cleared all of that up and given some background. I truly believe God created different roles for men, different roles for women that are complementary and doesn't make one less of a human than the other. But I think we, as God's people, need to just recognize that He made us different. Right?
Yes.
Thank you. So, anyway, I could spend a lot more time on that, but I don't want to. So, back to our text, 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. So just as we submit to our governing authorities in order to get people to understand, we trust in God. And so if our governing authorities are doing something we don't agree with, we can at some level submit to them because we trust that God's going to take care of everything. God's going to work everything out. And when people see that, hopefully they're going to say, wow, I want the same kind of peace and understanding and comfort and all this that you have. And then maybe we can make a difference in their lives. Same way we submit to masters. Now wives submit to their own husbands that same way. Because, going back into what we saw in chapter 2, verse 12, we are to live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse us of doing wrong, they may see our good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. And so all Christian wives are to submit to their husbands. But if a Christian is married to a non-believer, her submission, the purity and reverence of her life may be enough of a testimony to win that unbelieving husband to Christ. As we've talked about before, our very lives are supposed to be a testimony, and I think Peter confirms this when he says that the wife may win her husband over without talk. Now, this doesn't mean that she's never to say anything to her husband to encourage him to accept Christ. Okay? What it means is her primary way of showing her husband the love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, and all that stuff, Best way for her to demonstrate that is the way she lives with her husband, even if he is an unbeliever. That goes a lot further than the constant nagging. I wish you'd come to church with me. All my friends, their husbands go to church with them. I don't know why you won't go to church with me. That won't work, ladies. Okay? Just to let you know. So nagging doesn't work very well. So Peter says, do it by your example. We get down into verse 3 and 4, and he says, your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. Now, I'm sure you guys have met people before that say women are not supposed to wear fancy hairstyles. They're not supposed to wear gold jewelry and stuff because Peter says we're not supposed to. Have any of you ever heard religious people say that? Okay, couple of you have. That's not what Peter's saying. Peter's saying the demonstration of your life with Christ doesn't come from the externals. It comes from what's inside. And that's what we need to focus on. It's always, it kind of drives me crazy when people dress up for church on Sunday morning, but they live the most ratty life throughout the week. And I think we kind of get that backwards sometimes. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Get down to verse 5 and 6. For in this way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters, if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. So does anybody know where Sarah called Abraham her Lord? Well, in Genesis chapter 18, verse 12, this is when Sarah hears that she's going to be having a child. And in Genesis 18:12 says, so Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I am worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure? So Sarah refers to Abraham as her master. Now again, in 21st century, we're in 21st century now? Thank you. 21st century, we read of a woman calling her husband master, and immediately our minds go to, well, that's just wrong. He's not her master. But if we understand it the way God designed things to be, then it's appropriate, and it's not a negative thing. I call Jesus my master. It's not a negative thing. And so we need to keep it in that perspective. Now, it would be different if Abraham was abusive to Sarah. And we could read that whole story, and all of this stuff gets a little more complicated. Did Abraham cheat on Sarah? Not technically. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. In fact, she told him to do it, right? She didn't learn the lesson from Adam and Eve very well, but anyway. So, notice also here in verse 5 and 6 that Peter says, do not give way to fear. And we need to keep in mind that he was right, the world he was writing to, their view of wives was not a biblical view of wives either in the Jewish world or in the Roman world, which he's probably writing to a little of both of those. In the ancient world, it was expected that the wife would submit to her husband. That's what good wives did. And so, in this regard, Peter's instructions are the same as any other, even pagan writings on household instructions to all wives. The difference is that for these Christian wives, they must submit even if it means having to disobey their husbands. And in ancient times, in the ancient world, the husband was the head of the house, and what that meant in that ancient world was that what he said was law. Okay? He made all the decisions for the household. I'm going to kind of get off this a little bit. So in that world, the husband was the head who was domineering. He made every decision for the entire household. He even chose what gods they worshipped. And everyone in the household had to follow and worship those same gods that he did. Women who now become Christians can't worship those false gods anymore. So they have to disobey their husbands. Some women, out of fear, would just go along with their husbands. So Peter says, don't give in to fear. You need to stand and do what's right with God. Now, what I want us to keep in mind is when Jesus came on the scene and starts teaching the way God originally intended everything to be. And I think the Sermon on the Mount is great with this because so many times in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus will say, you have heard it was said this, but I tell you this. Jesus came to call people back from just the way society always did things to the way God really wanted it to be. So when Jesus shows up, husbands' roles are supposed to change too. They're not to just take the view that the rest of society does, and I'm the boss and I'm the head and what I say goes and you just have to give in and do what I tell you to do. You notice I'm not looking at Dory when I said that. Instead, Peter's going to tell us in a minute that husbands are supposed to live considerately with their wives. So the role changes not only for men, but it also changes for women. And I think this is just very important for us to understand because it helps our marriages, it helps our church, it helps everything. And I kind of got off track there just a little bit, but read some of my notes so I can get back on track.
Lance,
Yes.
to keep everything in balance, and I may have missed it in your introduction, I don't think I did, but you mentioned Ephesians 5:22.
Right.
But this might be an appropriate place based on your recent comment here. Did we look at Ephesians 5:25 because you're talking about role changes?
Right.
And here we have the society that we live in, the ruler dominating everything as you've described. But here in Ephesians 5:25, we have a complete reversal of that. And the husband is sacrificing himself for the wife.
Right.
As Christ did for the church.
Right.
Christ being the first sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice.
Right.
To keep that parallel accurate and true, the husband should be the first sacrifice in the relationship.
Thank you, Jerry. That's very important. And when Paul wrote that in their society, there were probably a lot of husbands going, "Ain't no way. I'm the man. I'm the head, and she's just got to do what I say." But again, Jesus brings something totally new into the world. Husbands, you're supposed to be willing to sacrifice yourselves for your wives. So, calling us back to what God originally intended turned their world upside down as much as it kind of rattles our world today. And so, I want us to wrap this up down here in verse 7, where he says, "Husbands, in the same way that Christians submit to their governing authorities that have been established by God, in the same way that slaves submit to their rulers, good and bad, in the same way wives submit to their husbands, in the same way be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect." I'm going to stop right there for just a second. What Peter is saying here is husbands are not to abuse their headship. They are to treat their wives in a certain way. The phrase that the NIV translates, "be considerate as you live with your wives," there in verse 7. Does anybody's translation say something different than that?
Live in an understanding way.
Live in an understanding way. Randy?
Yeah, likewise, live with your wives in an understanding way as with a weaker vessel.
Okay. Live with your wives in an understanding way. Literally, it could be translated, live with your wives according to knowledge.
That's what ASV says.
Of course. I was waiting for you, Roman. You got it. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about. Yeah. Live according to knowledge, and that's a very literal translation. In other words, husbands, you need to understand and know your wife. Guys are going like, that ain't happening, dude. Roman.
Just since I made a comment on it as well, like another one I did when you went to Ephesians, I feel like when you start meditating on all these instructions that God gives to husbands and wives, notice how he addresses things that we usually have issues with.
Yeah.
I read all those passages about husbands and wives, and nowhere do I read God telling wives to love their husbands. Why? Because it's natural.
Yeah.
Wives, women are very natural with love language and expressing their affection and all that.
Right.
For guys, it's not.
Yeah.
So that's why he tells husbands, love your wives.
Yeah. You know, in Ephesians, he says, husbands, love your wives. He says, wives, respect your husbands. There was a book that was written several years ago. The title of the book is Love and Respect. It's a kind of a marriage book. And it really does a pretty good job. I haven't read it in a long time, but it does a good job of showing how if wives respect their husbands the way they're called to, husbands will be more loving to their wives. If husbands are more loving to their wives will be more respectful of them. It kind of works, you know, but that gets us back into Ephesians. But what do you think Peter means when he talks about, you know, husbands, live with your wives according to knowledge? What does that mean, Randy?
I think if you're, God doesn't put us here without instruction.
Right?
And so it's a matter of us being able to be willing to understand and to learn what that instruction might be and how it directs our lives. It's a form of submission that each of us should have as a man and a woman in regards to our ability to serve our King.
Right.
We can't serve him well in ignorance.
Yeah.
And so as a result, what he's saying here, I think, is that the instruction you receive from your King, from your God, regarding how you conduct yourself with one another, matters, because if you cannot do it well, it cannot be God-pleasing if you try to do it on your own.
Right. Right. So live with your wives according to the knowledge of how God expects you to live with your wives, or to live in a relationship with each other.
Well, I think the knowledge of our relationship with God and the knowledge that you should have of your wife.
Yeah. Right.
That's the thing, and you know, going back to what Roman was saying, and I've heard it said before, God instructs us to do the hard things. He's never gonna instruct us to do
Right.
something so easy that would be, but that's, you know,
Yeah.
and it was striking me as you read this whole thing you've been talking, you know, of course, this fundamental issue of husbands and wives speaks to the greater of God and us, but of course that's what Satan's gonna try to destroy,
Right.
because that's the fundamental, how Christ is with us, how God is with us.
Right.
That's just fundamental to everything from the beginning, Adam and Eve.
Right.
Of course, that's gonna, in our 21st century mind, be offensive.
Right.
And I mean, that's been coming for generations and generations.
Yeah.
It's hard to wrap your mind around if you're in the world.
Right.
You don't understand
Right.
what the building blocks of that statement are. But
Yeah.
I just find it interesting. Of course, that's what Satan's going to try to destroy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Becky. I appreciate that. So I think, Roman, go ahead.
Sorry, just to piggyback off of my earlier comment, it would probably be an appropriate place. I'm sure you've heard about that anecdote, you know, about building a highway and understanding a woman, right? So,
You want to stand up? I want to make sure everybody knows this is coming. I don't know where this is going. Okay.
my point is, again, God instructs guys because we just want to charge head on, you know, on a horse, sword out and stuff.
Right.
He's like, no, it's a much more complex being. So
Yeah.
you might want to slow down
Yeah.
So it instructs us to do something that we don't naturally tend to do.
Exactly. I think that's key. I think live with them according to knowledge. Live with them according to a knowledge of what God has established, what God calls you to live, but also live with them as an understanding of who they are as your wife, as your spouse. Mark.
So, a few years ago, in the men's group on Tuesday, we read a book about how we have a tendency to look at Scripture through our culture today.
Right.
Instead of reading it, in the context that it was written, because we don't understand that.
Right.
So if you look at these instructions, they make more sense when you understand that most marriages at the time were contract marriages.
Yeah.
People didn't fall in love after dating and so forth, and
They were arranged marriages.
They were made
Yeah.
between the parents.
Right.
And women at the time were often closer to their blood relative males, their father, their brothers,
Right.
and so forth. Than their husband was just somebody they had to be with.
Right.
And so when you kind of think about that, some of these instructions, like living in an understanding way, like love your wife.
Right.
You're not just contracted to her.
Right.
It makes a little more sense in that regard.
Right. Yep.
And I have to say one other thing.
Yes, sir.
And, back to the verses that we read in Genesis. In Genesis chapter 1, it talks about God creating male and female and letting them rule over the earth, in that
Right.
context, as co-equal people.
Right.
And I think when we try to understand what all this means for our society, our culture, the church, and all of that, we need to keep in mind that when you're talking about this conflict and who has headship and all of that, that's part of the curse that God puts on humanity for disobedience.
Yeah, that goes
That's
back.
not necessarily the right or the best way.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so kind of keep it in that context.
Right.
And maybe there's a way to step above that.
Which I think is what Jesus calls his followers to do. And that's what Peter and Paul are writing, is you guys got to step above your culture and live the way God intended from the beginning. Now, I do want to finish this up because I want to make sure we get to the end of verse 7. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you to the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. When he talks about them being the weaker partner, that's not a negative thing. Women, believe it or not, are physically weaker than men most of the time. That's why now that we have all of these men participating in women's sports, because they identify as women, they're winning everything. Again, they're created differently, right? Everybody agree with that? Men and women are created different, right? But then notice also that when he says that, he says they're also co-heirs with you. Kind of like what Mark was saying in the beginning, he created them both to rule. You're both in this together. Again, it's not the man tells you what you need to believe and what you need to do. That was never God's intent. God's intent was for the two to become one, which means that the wife needs to become one with her husband. The husband needs to become one with their wives. But you understand that there are differences in them. As Roman said, we guys, we want to ride in on a white horse. And it took years for me to understand that if Dory came to me and wanted to talk about something, she didn't necessarily want me to fix it, right? Because she would come and she'd be talking about this or that, and I'd just tell her what she needed to do. Yeah. Debbie's back there going, ooh, no. Yeah, I learned that one too, I'd say, well, just do this. I didn't want you to fix it. I just wanted you to listen. I had to get some understanding there. And Dory and I are just wired very differently about things like that. And I think that's what Peter is talking about here. Wives, be submissive to your husbands, not the way the world defines submission. And going back, I said that a wife, in that culture, the husband would determine what gods they worshiped. And so if a woman became a Christian and she couldn't do that anymore, that tells us that submission does not mean just going along with everything that he says. There's stuff we got to work out in this. It's not as clear and black and white as we'd like for it to be, but hopefully this kind of gives us some things to think about. We have no time left at all for any questions. But if you have any, bring them next week. We'll try to answer those. But thank you guys for your comments. Thank you for the class. I appreciate it very much.